Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss the Roman civilization from its founding in about 753 BC to the end of the Roman Republic in about 27 BCE. So we're going to be discussing over 700 years of events. And in this video, we're going to compare the historical narrative of the Roman civilization to the archaeological evidence that scholars have recovered. As we begin, there's a couple of important things to note about Rome's location on the Italian peninsula and how this affects the development of Roman civilization during this period. The prime rule of real estate is location, location, location. And that's certainly true for archaeology and history as well. Rome was built on a series of 7 hills on the banks of the Tiber River. This would have given Rome easy access to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, via the Tiber River. And of course, the land around Rome would have been very fertile because it was built in a river valley. Also, Rome is on a fairly flat plain that's not very rocky compared to most of the land around it. The Italian peninsula is bisected by the Apennine Mountains, seen here. The Apennine Mountains, while difficult to traverse, are far less impassable than the mountains of Greece. The mountains in Greece played a major role in the development of the Greek civilization, specifically by preventing the Greek people from uniting until the time of Philip of Macedon. Remember, the Greeks, most of their time and most of their civilization's history, lived in city-states that came together for occasional alliances, but often fought each other as well. Rome, however, is going to be able to take over its neighbors in a way that the Greek city-states could not do. Also, Rome and Italy has more farmland and more access to rivers, more access to plains. This allows for larger populations, and larger populations equals larger militaries, and that allows a more centralized system of government and authority that just would have been impossible for the Greeks at this point in their history. The Greeks are not going to be united until much later in their history than the Romans. The historical and semi-mythological founders of Rome were Romulus and Remus. It's said that Romulus built the city of Rome in about the year 753 BCE. Romulus and Remus were said to be the twin sons of the god Mars, god of war, and Rhea Silva, a Vestal priestess. The king of Alba Longa, a settlement in central Italy, heard that the boys of divine parentage were born, and he ordered that they be killed via exposure by being placed in the Tiber River. Death by exposure was a very common way that infants were killed in ancient Mediterranean societies because either a family could not raise them or they did not want to raise a child. The infants were watched over by a mother wolf who fed them with her own milk until they were rescued by a man named Faustulus, who was a shepherd. At first, Faustulus did not raise the boys to know their true identity, but eventually they found out who they really were, and they planned revenge on the king of Alba Longa. After deposing their enemy, the king, Romulus and Remus planned to build a settlement for themselves on the Tiber River hills. Romulus chose the Capitoline Hill, and Remus chose the Aventine Hill. Each man chose their hill because of an omen from the gods that birds landed on the hill, but more birds landed on Romulus's hill than Remus's, so he took that as a sign that his location was correct. So Romulus builds a settlement on his hill, but Remus insulted the settlement, leading Romulus to kill him. This settlement eventually becomes Rome. It grows from a small settlement in central Italy into a city that controlled a multi-continental empire. It's worth noting that the myth of Romulus and Remus bears some similarities to other Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern mythological tales. Some similarities to the Cain and Abel story, brothers of Adam who kill, or Cain kills Abel. It's a Hebrew story. Although the killer, Cain in the Hebrew story, is the villain, not the hero. Also, the Hebrew story of Moses, a infant that's placed in a river. Romulus and Remus were placed in the Tiber. Moses was placed in the Nile River. And of course, there are some similarities between Romulus and Remus, feuding brothers who fight each other, and that of Osiris and Set of the Egyptian people. Osiris and Set fight each other, and Set kills Osiris. But Osiris goes on to become the god of the dead. This is a marble altar from Ostia. Ostia was a port city connected to Rome via the Tiber River. It features scenes from Roman history and mythology, namely Romulus and Remus being fed milk by a female wolf. So it shows that the story of Romulus and Remus is popular amongst the Romans, not only in their stories, but also in their material culture. It's shown on this marble altar here. Here is the Capitoline wolf. It's thought to have been made in about the 400s BCE. It's made in sort of an Etruscan orientalizing style. It's not made in the same style as Romulus and Remus. The bronzes, this is a bronze sculpture. These bronzes of the infants, Romulus and Remus, was added much later, probably in about the 1400s CE, during the Renaissance. In recent years, some scholars have argued that the Capitoline wolf was actually made in medieval times, and it's not made in Roman times, but the general consensus at this point is that the wolf is from Roman times, but the babies are from Renaissance times. And Romulus and Remus feature very prominently in Roman material culture, especially on coins. The Romans liked to decorate their coins with myths and stories and gods, but also with political figures like emperors and politicians. A lot like how modern American coins feature the profiles of U.S. presidents. And of course, they also are featured on reliefs as well. The Romans really liked relief carvings and relief sculptures. Here are some modern illustrations of the fight between Romulus and Remus. The artists have been careful to portray Romulus and Remus using, utilizing Etruscan and Villanovan style armor, the kind of armor that would have been used in that region in that period of history, rather than in like later Roman armor. So they're trying to keep the anachronisms to a minimum, even if they are cracking some jokes at the same time. So now we'll discuss some of the archaeological finds around the founding of Rome. Archaeologists and some historians believe that the city of Rome evolved from a series of fortified villages on these hills in the Tiber River Valley. The settlement on the hills would have provided a strategic advantage to the settlement's inhabitants, highlighting the militaristic origins of the Roman civilization. And of course, it also highlights the danger in which the Roman people would have lived early in their civilization as they're dealing with other city-states, hostile city-states to the north and to the south. The Etruscans to the north, Magna Graecia to the south, and other peoples that live on the Italian peninsula. And of course, experiences that the early Romans had during the monarchy period and during the founding of their settlement will impact Roman culture for centuries to come, into the Republic and into the Empire. The city of Rome's population at its greatest extent would have been between 450,000 and 100 million, not 100, 1 million people. There's a lot of variation in these numbers because Romans conducted censuses, but the methodology used in their censuses was often not very standardized. So sometimes children were counted and sometimes they were not. And that's why scholars offer such a wide kind of estimate of Rome's population at its greatest extent. But remember, even as Rome became a big city and then eventually grew to rule an empire, it started out as a series of small settlements. Settlements said to have been founded by Romulus. This is an excavation of a Roman house from about the 600s BCE. So this would be during the what is called the monarchical period of Rome. The settlement, or the house, is actually pretty large compared to other houses nearby. It highlights that the Romans, even from the beginning, were very interested in building big houses. We think that wealthy Romans built big houses early on because they were engaging in the Roman system of obligation, or the Roman system of patronage, which required that wealthy people have large houses, not only to show off their wealth, but so that they could entertain other wealthy people and then receive poor people as guests. We'll talk about the patronage system later in this video. So here we'll talk about the historical narrative of the Roman monarchy. Romulus rules as king of Rome from 753 to 16 BCE when he miraculously or mysteriously disappears. As king, Romulus recognized that his city lacked population, so he and his followers, his soldiers, they kidnapped single women from the Sabine settlement to act as their wives, so they could increase their population. The Sabine men retaliated, wanting to rescue their sisters and their daughters, and they attacked Rome. The daughters, however, and sisters refused to go back, as they had married Romans and they'd actually had a chance to bear children with the Romans. So the counterattack must have happened much later. And this story highlights the militarism of Roman society and the emphasis they put on conquest, but it also highlights their belief that women's highest obligation was to serve as wives and mothers, but also as peacemakers between men who were supposed to be more violent and more warlike. And the Sabines are eventually going to be absorbed into the Roman civilization. Romulus ruled the city of Rome, or the town of Rome, with the help of an elite class of people called the senators. Senator comes from the Latin word for old people, senior. And of course the senators were men. This was a patriarchal society. The legends say that Romulus disappeared, perhaps in a cloud of thunder and lightning, but perhaps a more logical, more likely explanation is that the senators killed Romulus. They were worried about his power, that he was becoming too powerful, and they assassinated him. And then they hid his body to hide the fact that they had killed him by saying he'd been consumed by a cloud. They may have even come up with a story that he was taken to Mount Olympus by the god Mars as a way of hiding possible treachery on their part. Rome would be ruled by a total of 7 kings between 753 and 509 BCE. The Senate and the elite classes of Rome, called the patricians, generally didn't like kings very much. Kings threatened their power, and also monarchs tended to be very appealing to regular people, the plebeians, who often saw the king as being a guardian or protector against the wealthy. By the way, the patricians, sort of the nobility of Roman society, were descendants of about 130 founding families who helped create the city of Rome. The plebeians, of course, were everyday people, some of whom actually did become wealthy. This is an image of the shrine or the tomb of Romulus. It's under the Forum of Rome. No body has been found at the site, highlighting the mythological story that Romulus was taken away in a cloud, or more likely killed by the Senate and then had his body hidden. But the Romans also, remember, they practiced cremation of the dead. They did not like to practice inhumation as much, inhumation being the process of burying a person in the ground and allowing their body to decompose naturally. So it's possible that the the senators burned Romulus's body and hid his ashes, rather than allowing him to be buried in a tomb, which would have revealed that they may have killed him. The tomb or shrine of Romulus is underneath the forum, highlighting the layers of occupation at the site. Here is, of course, from the monarchical period, and then later layers are from the Republican and imperial period in Roman history. This is a plan of the forum with several overlays. The green is the original forum. People would come together and to what were called assemblies or committees and councils, and they would vote on a variety of matters. Certain people in Roman society got to vote on certain things in the Republic. Over time, the forum was enlarged and larger buildings were built, basilicas, curias. These were government buildings in which the Senate would meet to make laws and to pass legislative sessions and things of that nature. And of course, the Forum was in the center of the ancient city of Rome. It's roughly analogous to what the Agora was in Athens. So most of the documentary evidence we have of the Roman monarchy period is heavily mixed with legend and myth. So we have to corroborate it with archaeological sources. And archaeological sources suggest that the Romans did in fact have kings, although their position in society was probably quite different than how it's portrayed in the myths in the documentary sources. On the left-hand side of this slide is a pot shard from some black figured pottery made by the Etruscans. It's a drinking vessel that mentions a Rex Sacrorum, or a king of sacrifices. On the right-hand side is a what's called the lapis niger stele. Stele, of course, is a large carved piece of stone. It mentions a king of sacrifices as well, and some of the duties of the king of sacrifices. Translating these inscriptions on these pieces of material culture is a little bit difficult because some of them are written in Etruscan, this cup, and of course this stele is written not only in Latin, but really in a mix of Etruscan and Greek and Latin alphabetical symbols. Some scholars think this king of sacrifices may have been Romulus, and that the king was basically a religious leader in addition to being a spiritual leader or political leader as well. And of course, this stele was found near the Forum, highlighting that this king of sacrifices probably had political power as well as religious authority. Some more information about the kings of Rome. These are semi-mythical figures, so we have to rely on archaeological sources to corroborate the myths. And the archaeological sources suggest that there were, in fact, kings in Rome at this period, although the actual exploits of the kings were probably quite different. Depictions of these kings usually are from centuries later, and they're on things like coins. Remember, the Romans like to feature political leaders and mythological figures on coins. The documentary sources we have about these kings were written centuries later. They were not written by eyewitnesses. A couple of important kings, Numa Pompilius. He was a Sabine, or said to be a Sabine. He was said to have created Roman religious institutions like the Pontifex Maximus, or the high priest, who was a religious leader, a high priest, but also a political leader as well. He could be elected to that position. This, of course, reveals the close ties between the Roman state and the Roman religion. The Romans did not have a separation of church and state in the modern sense. That would have been an anathema to them. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, also known as Tarquin the Proud, was of Etruscan ancestry. And in these mythological stories, you see there's tension between the kings and the Senate and the patrician classes. The upper classes don't really like the kings. They don't trust the kings. And that eventually leads to the upper classes rebelling against the monarchy, which seems very plausible from a historical and archaeological perspective, although the stories we have about the kings are perhaps embellished over time. In the mythological documentary sources, the event that leads to the upper class revolting against the kings is the sexual assault of Lucretia, the daughter of a wealthy Roman patrician. She was violently sexually assaulted at sword point by Sextus Tarquinius, Prince Sextus Tarquinius, and the son of Tarquin the Proud. Lucretia actually committed suicide because she had been violated and disgraced by being raped. Although her family tried to keep her from doing that, ending her life. The Civil War was led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a wealthy man who recruited the Roman upper class to revolt against the king. That makes sense because these upper class men would have been the people who could afford swords and armor and weapons, and would have been in the best position to gain the most by deposing the monarch, because then they would take control of the government. The king, Tarquin the Proud, had support from the Etruscans, according to the legend, which it makes sense that this legend would feature this, because we know that the Romans talked about the Etruscans as being enemies, and how they eventually took over the Etruscan civilization. And of course, these stories, the story of Lucretia, the story of the destruction of the Roman monarchy and the founding of the Republic, these stories have become a major part of the Roman identity, and then of course the identity and the culture of many other Western European civilizations. In about 509 BC, the elite Romans, after defeating the kings, they set up the Roman Republic. Remember, Lucius Brutus was their leader. This is a bronze of Brutus from much later. They create a republic, which comes from the Latin words res publica, or public thing, or commonwealth. This is not a direct democracy like Athens. It's a very oligarchic system. Although Athens was going through some significant political changes at about the same time, about 510 BC, they were embracing democracy. So it's interesting to see this happening in different parts of the Mediterranean at about the same time. The elite patrician class would have a lot more power in the Roman Republic. They could vote for more things. They had more voting rights, and they could hold offices that plebeians could not hold. Plebeians had some voting rights, but not as many. There were also property requirements for plebeians, although the property requirements for voting actually allowed some wealthier plebeians to vote for the things that only the patricians could previously vote for. So in some ways, property requirements for voting were actually kind of forward-thinking by the standards of the day. At the same time, though, plebeians maintained the system by serving in the military, in citizen militias at this point in Roman history. They were a lot like the Greek hoplite system. Rome is not going to develop a standing army until about the 80s BCE, towards the end of the Republic. This system was designed to help the elite consolidate and remain in power, but there were some forward-thinking elements in the Roman Republic. Property requirements allowed people who were not the nobility, not the patricians, not descendants of the founding families, to have a chance to vote, although they had to be wealthy. And of course, later governments would copy many elements of the Roman Republic, particularly the balance of powers between the executive and the legislative branches of government. Most notably, the United States would copy elements of the Roman Republic in addition to Greek democracy. It's also worth noting that the Roman Republic's greatest enemy in this period, Carthage, also was ruled by a Senate. This is a diagram of how the Roman Republic functioned. The Senate was the legislative branch, although they actually could not pass laws. What they did was they advised people called the consuls, who were basically the executive branch. And there were 2 consuls, and they were elected annually. They were not elected by the people, though. Instead, the people voted for others. They voted for censors and praetors, um, or at least patricians voted for censors and praetors who appointed members of the Senate. And plebeians voted for what were called tribunes, representatives of the plebeian people. And wealthier plebeians could enter higher ranked assemblies. This slide will be available on the course page if you want to look at it more closely. I'm just showing it here to give kind of a basic presentation of how the Roman Republic government structure worked. This is how the Roman Republic worked in the forum itself. The male citizens would come together in the forum, meeting in an area called the comitatum. They would be formed into assemblies. They were also known as councils. Only the patrician assemblies could vote on censors. The censors would then vote on senators. The censors had very important positions in Roman society. They conducted the censuses, counting up the Roman people for demographic and taxation purposes. Censors were also expected to safeguard and protect Roman culture and morality as well. Plebeians were able to vote on certain things, like the tribunes, who were their representatives, but they could not vote directly for senators. They could not vote directly for consuls. It was a very oligarchic type of republic. And women and children could not vote, even if they were citizens, and slaves could not vote. Although slaves could become citizens, although it was very difficult, which is really very remarkable in the ancient world. Many ancient societies had slavery, but very few of them allowed former slaves to become citizens, to have the same rights as free people. Here are some photographs of the forum. You can see multiple layers of occupation. The forum will be important throughout the Roman Republic, which lasts for about 500 years. And then the forum will be an important place during the imperial period of Rome as well. Although during the empire, the Senate doesn't have the kind of power that it had during the Republic. Here are some recreations of the Senate. This is the Senate building, a reconstruction of it in the Forum complex. The senators would have gathered together in a semicircular room. At certain points in the history of the Republic, there were between 300 and 900 senators. Younger, junior senators were expected to defer to senior senators in terms of votes. They were supposed to follow those who were older, who were supposed to be more experienced and more knowledgeable. Roman system was very focused on respect to authority. And you can see that in their government systems. Also remember that the Senate did not actually pass laws. They just made sort of advisory statements to the consuls who usually followed what the Senate said, but were not obligated to do so. During times of turmoil and times of danger, the Roman Republican system could be temporarily suspended, and absolute power could be put in the hands of one man, called a dictator or dictator. Usually the dictator or dictator was a general, someone with considerable military experience, and the dictator would rule, having power over both the military and the civil government of Rome for about 6 months, or until the crisis was averted. This was considered to be an obligation and a civic duty. The dictator would step down from power after the crisis had been averted, or after 6 months, whichever came first. The most famous dictator was Cincinnatus. He would rule Rome and fight on Rome's behalf in one of their wars with a rival on the Italian peninsula in about 458 BCE. This is actually a statue of Cincinnatus. I believe it's from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is named after Cincinnatus, but also named after George Washington, American first president and American general, who was said to be the American version of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, after saving Rome, went back to a simple life on the farm. He went back to his plow. and that was considered to be a value that both the Romans and the Americans thought was very positive. He did not keep his power like a king. Later, Roman dictators would not give up their power so easily. Generals in Roman society had a lot of power as well. Victorious generals were called imperators, Latin for victor, and the symbol of victory and power was the fasces. The sticks were meant to represent unity and authority, particularly unity and authority to use corporal punishment or whippings against people in peacetime. And then the axe in wartime was meant to symbolize capital punishment, the idea that generals during wartime had the authority to execute people without trials because it was a time of danger. And of course, to us today, the term dictator and the symbol of the fasces have many negative connotations. But to the Romans, they were not seen negatively. So now we'll discuss citizenship in the Roman Republic. Citizens had fewer rights in Rome than in Greece. There were fewer things that they could vote on. Unlike Athens, for example, Rome was not a direct democracy. But on the whole, it was easier to become a citizen in the Roman civilization. For the Greeks, citizenship usually meant being Greek, having one or more parents who were Greek or from a certain Greek city-state. There were other ways that non-Roman people could become Roman citizens. Generally, in order to be a citizen, you had to be born in Roman territory, or at least born in the Italian peninsula. The definitions of what it means to be a citizen will change. Usually you had to have at least one parent be a citizen of Rome. But you could also join as a Roman citizen through military service, which we'll talk about in a later video. So what it takes to become a citizen changes over time. In general, though, it becomes easier to become a citizen across the history of the Roman civilization. In the Italian peninsula, all free adult males were given citizen rights, civitas, after the rebellion and social war of 90 through 88 BCE. As the Roman Republic expanded, it would conquer peoples who were called provincials. And the provincials were not automatically given citizenship in most cases, but they would be offered pathways to citizenship during the imperial period, usually through military service or through a decree from the Senate or through the empire. Citizens or potential citizens had to adopt Roman language, Latin, and elements of Roman culture, and they had to participate in Roman civic culture and civic religion or civil religion. Also, only Roman citizens could wear togas. It was a symbol of citizenship for Roman men. And of course, Roman citizenship models are going to inspire the citizenship models of later nations and empires. Slaves had the potential to become citizens after gaining their freedom, but it was usually very difficult for slaves to become citizens because in general, slaves were usually non-Roman people, captives from other cultures. Women could become citizens, but they did not have voting rights the way men did. They also did not have property rights in the same way that citizen men did. So they were basically second-class citizens. Now we'll talk about systems of obligation in Roman society from basically the beginning well through the empire. Perhaps the most important system of obligation that held Roman society together was the patronage or patron-client system. In this system, wealthy people called patrons would give money, food, and legal assistance to clients, who were poorer people who would give them respect, would show them deference, and in some cases would vote for them in assemblies. Patricians were often patrons to clients in the plebeian class, but some wealthier plebeians could become patrons for poorer plebeians as well. Wealthy people would build large houses for themselves to accommodate visits from their clients. The clients would visit oftentimes every day to receive food and to receive guidance and orders from the patrons. And the patrons always referred to their clients as friends, but the clients were expected to be very formal with the patrons. They always referred to the patron as my patron. And this system would endure into the Roman Empire, but it's going to become much more expensive and expansive over time, to the point where the Roman Empire will act as a patron for non-Roman client states, who are expected to defer to the Roman Empire in exchange for protection, military protection, and alliances. So obligation is a key part of Roman society, and there's a lot of documentary and material evidence to back this up. In addition to a system of obligation that governed Roman society, the Romans had very important values and family structures that also kind of governed how people lived on a daily basis. Roman society was patriarchal, but probably less so than the Greeks. The men had the power in Roman society, but women had more opportunities for influence in the Roman society than women in the various Greek city-states did. Men generally married in their late 20s to women in their mid-teens, so there is a big age gap. Women were expected to remain celibate until marriage. Men were not expected to remain celibate until marriage or even within marriage. Men often had sexual relations with prostitutes, slaves, and in some cases with other men. Men or fathers were known as the paterfamilias, father of the family. And the paterfamilias had legal power of life and death over his household, over his family, over his slaves. But men were supposed to put country and family over themselves. They were supposed to sacrifice for other people, and they were only supposed to exercise their paterfamilias power for good. They were not supposed to abuse their powers. But there was little legal recourse to stop them from doing that. Instead, it was all about obligation, cultural and social obligation. Men were obligated to their women and their children. Men who mistreated or did not care for their families would be disgraced. They'd be seen as having a lack of honor, a lack of faith, a lack of virtus or virtue is what it would have meant. Virtue was a very important value to the Roman people, a lot like what arete was to the Greeks. Men also had obligations to Rome as well. Rich men were expected to serve in politics, to take care of clients, and they were expected to serve as military commanders. Poor men would serve as enlisted soldiers in the military, and they would vote in the assemblies for which they were qualified, and they would do favors for their patrons. Women did not have political rights the way male citizens did, but they were considered to be influential. Wives attended their husbands' dinner parties, known as epulum, in order to help their husbands gain approval from their male peers. This is very different than the Greeks, who did not allow women to attend symposia, their dinner parties. The only women that went to Greek dinner parties were slaves who were attending to the meal, taking the plates away and things like that, or female companions, prostitutes who provided entertainment to the male guests. Roman society could be very culturally syncretistic, bringing in cultural traditions from conquered peoples, but the Romans at the same time didn't like any idea that was too new or that hadn't been tried. They were more suspicious of new ideas than the Greeks were. They would take ideas from other cultures, but those ideas had to be time-tested and time-honored if Romans were to adopt them, because new ideas, they might threaten existing systems of obligation and patronage, systems that held Roman society together. The Roman religion was based around the Olympian gods of the Greeks, just with different names, highlighting that the Romans were not afraid to adopt things from other cultures. They just wanted things that were time-tested. And of course, by the 700s and 500s, the Greeks have been worshiping the Olympian gods for arguably centuries. So the Romans felt confident in taking these gods for themselves, although they gave them different names and slightly different attributes. Also, the Romans' favorite gods were sometimes different than the favorite gods of the Greeks. For example, Mars, the god of war to the Romans, was much more popular to the Romans than Ares, god of war, was to the Greeks. The Romans worshipped the Olympian Greek pantheon, but they gave the gods different names. These names were probably of Etruscan origin. Also, the Roman gods had slightly different attributes as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. The Romans worshipped these gods by building temples for them, by sacrificing to them. They also created what were called cults, and cults were groups of priests and priestesses who dedicated their lives to serving the god or goddess of the cult for often 20 or 30 years. One of the most famous cults was the cult of Vestia, in which Vestal virgins acted as priestesses for Vestia. Vestia was the goddess of the hearth and of the home. The attributes of the Roman gods were similar, but slightly different. On the whole, the Romans saw their version of the Olympians as being less interested in human morality and being more focused on just being patron deities of things like warfare in the case of Mars, or family in the case of Juno, who corresponds to the Greek goddess Hera, or Vestia, Roman goddess of the hearth, corresponds to Hestia, Greek goddess of the hearth. They were much more about institutions than they were about morality. So for the Romans, honoring gods was very important, but also honoring their obligations to humans was very important. And we think that obligations to the gods was a little bit different, and obligations to the humans was much more important in Roman society because Romans developed a legal code very quickly and very early in their civilization. The earliest Roman legal code was the 12 Tables. And also remember, the Romans put a lot more emphasis on obligation than the Greeks did. Over time, the Romans would worship gods from non-Greek cultures as well. Gods that they trusted, gods that they thought were worth worshiping. And religion was an important part of Roman politics. Making sacrifices to the gods and serving as a priest or a priestess was not only a religious duty, but a civic one. Remember, the Romans did not have a notion of a separation of church and state. Here is a modern recreation of a ritual by the Vestal virgins. They had to keep the sacred flame of Vestia going. That flame represented not only the goddess Vestia, but the life and vitality of Rome. If the flame ever went out, it was going to be dangerous for the Romans. And it was said that if the flame had gone out, it was because one of the Vestal virgins had violated her vow of chastity. She had had sex with a human male outside of her position as priestess, which was forbidden. If a priestess of Vestia had consensual sex with someone outside of her vows, she would be killed. She would be put inside of a building that was being built, and then they would surround her with bricks and stones, and she would die of suffocation, being trapped inside a building. In addition to religion, Romans also copied many elements of Greek culture. One such element they copied was sculpture. The Romans copied a lot of the same trends in sculpture as the Greeks. This may have been because a lot of sculptors at work in Rome were actually Greek. During the early Republican period, the Romans tended to copy classical Greek styles, which were being made at about the same time. This would be about the 500s to about the 200s BCE. So they were a little bit behind the Greeks in some ways, but they were very focused on beauty and perfection during this period. This center statue, which is of a Vestal Virgin is set up on the principles of perfection, not necessarily on the principles of being realistic. In the later Republican period, the Romans sort of copied the Hellenistic styles, which did not emphasize perfection, but emphasized being realistic and being true to life. So during about the 200s to about 27 BCE, you see that less perfect but more realistic busts and sculptures like this one are created. And the Romans made their sculptures from a variety of materials, including both bronze and marble. And over time, though, the Romans would depart a little bit from the Greeks. The Romans were much more interested in portraiture, that is, portraits of specific individuals, than the Greeks were. This is probably because of the nature of the obligation patronage system in Roman society. Wealthy Romans that could afford a sculpture would have a sculpture or a bust of themselves made and have it placed in their house to show off their wealth to their clients and to inspire confidence amongst their clients. And that's an area where they would have departed from the Greeks. The Greeks generally preferred to not spend too much money on art for their homes. If a wealthy person in Greece was going to purchase art, he was going to purchase art to be displayed in public for people as a whole, not just for family and friends. The Romans also really liked reliefs. The Greeks made reliefs as well, but the Romans really expanded on relief sculpture. And both men and women are portrayed in Roman sculpture. This is the Roman legal system, the 12 Tables. It was established in between 451 and 450 BCE. They were on bronze tablets that were placed in the Forum, similar to this image here. The 12 Tables was based on Athenian law created by Solon about 200 or so years before. This 12 table system was meant to codify kind of existing Roman legal customs. And it was designed to prevent abuse of the plebeians or the clients by the patrician patron class. But these laws were written by 10 patricians without any kind of plebeian consultation. But a legal system like this would have been necessary to set up laws by which a patron would not abuse his clients, but also clients would not take advantage of the largesse of their patrons. The 12 Tables would form the basis for later Roman laws and later civil law codes. Nowadays, when you hear that a country has a civil law code as compared to a common law code, it means that country has patterned its legal systems off of Rome's law code, which goes back to the laws of the 12 Tables. And the laws were enforced in courts by judges called magistrates. And jury trials were much less common in the Roman civilization than they were in Athens, where jury trials were the norm. And this is an illustration of the 12 Tables, what each chapter or each table covers. You see the rights of the paterfamilias are described. There's rights or laws about debt. Many clients would have fallen into debt to their patrons, but also a lot of patrons could fall into debt trying to give money and help to their clients. So you can see the need for a legal system because of the Roman system of patronage. So now that we've discussed the laws of early Rome, we can discuss slavery, crime, and punishment in the Roman Republic and beyond. Throughout Rome's history, slavery was an essential part of the labor force and part of the Roman economy. Slaves accounted for 10 to 20% of the population, or 25 to 40% of the urban population. Those numbers tend to fluctuate a little bit based on census data from ancient Rome, and of course on material sources and documentary sources. Scholars will debate those exact numbers. Slaves in Roman society were property. The Romans practiced chattel slavery. The paterfamilias had life and death power over slaves, just as he had power over his family. Some slaves received better treatment than others, especially many Greek slaves were employed as tutors or teachers for wealthy Roman children. They lived pretty well. They had nice clothing. They had nice living arrangements. They were still slaves, which is not good, but their life was better than a Roman laboring slave who worked all day long and did not have such benefits. And slavery was not based on race in the Roman civilization, although non-Roman people were more likely to be slaves than Roman citizens. But Romans who had fallen into debt could be enslaved as a way of forcing them to pay their debts off. Also, some Romans may have actually chosen to become gladiator slaves. Gladiators were a type of slave that was treated better, although their life as a gladiator was very dangerous. It was considered unvirtuous in Roman society to treat slaves badly. It was a violation of obligation. A slave was obligated to serve his master and obey his master, but a master was obligated to take good care of his slave. Obviously, they didn't really take very good care of their slaves. There were several slave revolts, which the Romans called servile wars in the Roman Republic. The most famous was the Third Servile War of 73 to 71 BCE, in which slaves led by a gladiator named Spartacus revolted and tried to escape Italy. Spartacus and his slaves initially had a lot of success because a lot of them were gladiators, very skilled fighters. But eventually they were defeated by the Roman military, and it's estimated that about 6,000 slaves were crucified, executed as punishment, and as an example to other slaves to dissuade them from revolting. Capital punishment was common in the Roman civilization, but only non-citizens could be crucified. After the 200s BCE, Roman citizens could not be whipped unless they were in the army. That was a punishment for non-citizens and slaves. Civilian citizens could also choose to avoid capital punishment by agreeing to be banished, to leave the Roman territories. Although they couldn't do that for treason. A Roman citizen accused of treason would face capital punishment, although he was entitled to a trial in Rome. Here are some material evidence for slavery in the Roman civilization. We see shackles. We see a bronze showing a slave in a stress position. Stress positions are uncomfortable positions that people are put in, arguably as a form of torture or punishment. Here is skeletal remains of a slave that was found in what is now France, or Gaul, as the Romans would have called it. Gladiators were slaves in ancient Rome. Gladiators were basically the professional athletes in the Roman civilization. A lot of them were very famous, and a lot of them even had wealth and had a following by fans, but that they were still slaves. They still lived a difficult life because they had to risk their lives and face death in the arena as part of their enslavement. And remember, Spartacus was a gladiator. So now we'll discuss crucifixion briefly and the archaeological evidence for it. Crucifixion is mentioned throughout Roman documentary sources, but archaeological evidence for crucifixion is a lot more sparse. Remember, Roman citizens were not crucified. If they were going to be executed, they would be killed through other manners. Crucifixion was considered to be a painful and humiliating way to die. Therefore, it was reserved for non-Roman citizens and for slaves who were not citizens. It's also worth noting that the Romans probably did not invent crucifixion. However, there's not a lot of material evidence for crucifixion. We think this is because the bodies of people killed by crucifixion, their bodies were just left up on their crosses. They were not buried. And then they could be picked apart by scavengers, once again adding to the humiliation that they could not even receive a proper burial. So there, of course, would not be articulated remains of crucifixion victims. What evidence we have found suggests that the type or way that people were crucified varied significantly. Many victims of crucifixion had their heels, each heel nailed to the cross separately, usually through the side. And in general, we find that people usually had their wrists nailed to crosses rather than their hands, because the hand would not be strong enough to hold up the body of the crucified person. But we'll talk more about crucifixion and why it's important in later videos. Now that we've discussed Roman legal systems and politics and labor, we can discuss warfare in the Roman Republic. Warfare was a major part of life in the Roman civilization, and it was an important part of how the Roman civilization grew and advanced itself. Early in its history, the Roman civilization, the Republic, went to war with neighbors in Italy, eventually taking over the Italian peninsula by about 220 BCE. The Roman Republic was also invaded by its neighbors like the Celts in 387 BCE. We discussed that in a previous video. And it will also be invaded by the Carthaginians between 218 and 203 BCE. These Roman military victories brought wealth, especially in the form of captives, slaves, into the Roman civilization. And the wealth brought in by these wars of conquests, it funds the Roman civilization, the Republic, and the Empire. It also brings in new lands and conquered people, providing a labor force. Some of these conquered peoples would become citizens, although the way that a person could become a citizen varied significantly across time. These wars would have been very expensive, but they would have sustained Rome's economy by bringing in plunder, treasures, slaves, and new lands. Even as these wars advanced the Roman civilization, they would have also caused some internal problems for the Roman people. They caused an increased wealth gap between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the military commanders, and they got the largest share of the spoils of war. The plebeians, who were the enlisted soldiers, got far less from this fighting, even though they were also risking their lives to fight. And of course, during this period, the Roman military system is not a professional standing army. It's militias. It's part-time citizen soldiers who are basically conscripted into service. They have to leave their civilian jobs behind. They have to leave their families behind. And if they are killed or they are wounded and can no longer provide for their families become even more dependent on the patronage system of the patricians. So it can also lead to class conflict, even as it brings great wealth into the civilization. In about the 80s BCE, the militia system is replaced with a larger standing army. And there's a lot of benefits to having a standing army because these are professional soldiers. They're not being taken away from civilian life to fight. But these professional soldiers over time become more loyal to their generals and their imperators, who lead them in successful military campaigns, help them take in spoils of war, and they become less loyal to the Senate. And that leads to the dissolution of the Roman Republic. Finally, by 27 BCE, it's completely replaced by the Roman Empire. So who were the soldiers in the Roman Republic? Well, only men could serve as soldiers in the Roman Republic. Soldiers primarily came from the middle of plebeian society, people who were not super wealthy, but they were wealthy enough to purchase their own weapons and armor when they joined these citizen militias, which were semi-compulsory. It was part of your obligation to being a citizen. Some of these armies were large enough to be considered legions of 5,000 troops. Lower level officers were called centurions, and they commanded about 100 troops and support personnel. The Roman militia system is very similar to the Greek hoplite system in the sense that it's citizens acting as soldiers, providing their own weapons and armor. They're also the heavy infantry armed with swords and shields and helmets. They're supplemented by cavalry, who are wealthier men who can afford their own horses. They're also supplemented by light infantry, who cannot afford armor, and they often just fight with bows and arrows or javelins. So poorer men can serve in the military, but they serve more as light infantry. Also, poorer men often serve in the Navy as well. There were several defining military conflicts in the Roman Republic, which will help to strengthen the Roman civilization, but will also set it on its path towards becoming the Roman Empire. Um, Perhaps the most important are the Punic Wars that the Roman Republic fought with the Carthaginian civilization. As Rome consolidated its holdings on the Italian peninsula and expanded southward, it came into contact but also conflict with the Carthaginian civilization, which was in North Africa and then in the islands off the coast of Italy, Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. The Romans tried to help a group of mercenaries in the island of Sicily, which led to a diplomatic disagreement with Carthage that led ultimately to the First Punic War. This was fought from 264 to 241 BCE. And initially, the Carthaginians had an edge because they had a larger navy and they were much more experienced as sailors than the Romans were. We discussed the Carthaginian maritime tradition in a previous video. The Romans were, however, able to leverage their large population, the ample amount of farmlands they had, and their militia system to build up their armies and then build a large navy that eventually outclassed the Carthaginian navy. They built more ships, they built bigger ships, and then they built new naval technologies like the Ravenclaw, which was a bridge that allowed Roman Marines to get aboard or storm aboard Carthaginian ships. The Carthaginians may have been more skilled sailors, but the Romans were much better at fighting with, in hand-to-hand combat because of their fighting on the Italian peninsula. So they used technology, but also their cultural traditions to eventually defeat the Carthaginians and take control of these islands off the coast of Italy, which gives the Romans their first territory outside of the Italian peninsula. Here are some scenes from the First Punic War. The first is a modern artist's recreation of what the Ravenclaw would have looked like. You can see the Carthaginians on the left fighting against the Romans. The Romans, however, you can see their iconic scutum oblong shields. They're storming onto the deck of the Carthaginian vessel. Here is a Roman relief from about the 200s BCE. You can see the similarities between, you can see the artist is inspired by this Roman relief. They're using very similar shields and similar helmets. Here are some archaeological finds that we think are from the First Punic War. Here are some helmets that would have been worn by soldiers. Obviously, they probably belonged to soldiers who fell into the water and either died from wounds or drowned. You can also see different types of rams that were used to sink enemy vessels. The Romans built larger ships than the Carthaginians. They built a quinquereme, which was similar to the older Greek trireme, but it had 5 rows of sailors instead of 3. Because it had more sailors, it could be a lot larger and faster. It could also carry more marines, and they could also outfit these larger vessels with the Ravenclaw and then with a aft castle, which could be used as a position to fire arrows at enemy ships. So these larger ships are able to overcome the Carthaginians' smaller vessels. The Second Punic War, which is probably the most famous of the Punic Wars, was fought from about 218 to 201 BCE. It was fought because Rome had supported a city called Saguntum in the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain. Also, the Carthaginians wanted revenge on the Romans for taking their island territories. This war saw the Carthaginian general Hannibal, on the right-hand side of this slide, lead an army of war elephants across the Alps into Italy. By the way, this is a Roman portrayal of Hannibal. We don't exactly know what he would have looked like. With the help of Celtic allies and also some war elephants, Hannibal is able to defeat the Roman army at Cannae on the Italian peninsula. And then Hannibal fights the Romans for about 15 years on the Italian peninsula. Eventually, though, the Romans are able to outlast the Carthaginians and push them out of Italy. And then the Romans are able to counterattack. They lead a counterattack led by a general named Scipio on Carthage. And Scipio, like Hannibal did, getting the Celts to join his side, Scipio got the Numidian people of North Africa to join the Romans in fighting the Carthaginians. Basically what happens is Hannibal is defeated and he is forced to leave Carthage. The Romans take Iberia, what becomes Hispania or Spain, from the Carthaginians. And they also take some territory from the Carthaginians in North Africa. At this point, Carthage is basically a rump state that just consists of Carthage and a little bit of territory around the city. The Romans tried to turn Carthage into a client state that had to obey Rome. The Carthaginians, however, don't want to obey Rome, and some diplomatic issues between the two civilizations will lead to the Third Punic War, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. This is the Roman and the Carthaginian civilizations at the time of the Punic Wars. You can see that the Carthaginians have lost their islands in the Mediterranean, or at least the islands close to Italy, but they still have a good portion of the Iberian Peninsula and a good portion of North Africa. There is good archaeological evidence to suggest that the Second Punic War occurred, as was the case with the First Punic War. We see some Carthaginian coins featuring elephants, presumably war elephants. These coins actually look fairly similar to those made by the Romans, which is interesting. Also, this is a relief of a Celt-Iberian soldier. The Celt-Iberians were Celtic peoples who lived in Iberian Peninsula. They initially fought with the Carthaginians, but they actually switched sides and started fighting with the Romans later in the conflict as the war turned in favor of the Romans. This is a painting of Hannibal's march across the Alps. He had to march across the cold, snowy Alpine mountains into Italy. Many of his war elephants died during this freezing cold march, as you might expect, being tropical animals. But he was joined by Celtic peoples who had no love of the Romans. Granted, the Celtic peoples, some fought with the Romans as well on their side, but some fought against them with the Carthaginians. This is the Battle of Cannae, fought on the 2nd of August, 216 BCE. It's estimated that about 50,000 Carthaginians defeated a much larger Roman force of 84,000. The Carthaginians used some really ingenious tactics. They basically tricked the Romans into charging the Carthaginian line, thinking that they had defeated the Carthaginians. And then as the Romans are pouring into the Carthaginian lines, the Carthaginian cavalry surrounds the Roman rear, and they basically surround the Romans and destroy them. It's one of the worst military defeats the Romans ever experienced. And it would lead to the Carthaginians basically spending the next 10 plus years in Italy, in the heartland of the Roman civilization. And this slide shows an image of Celtic and Carthaginian soldiers fighting Romans. This is a rough tracing of Hannibal's march, his 15-year-long march through Italy. You can see he starts in the Alps and works his way down and moves across the peninsula. You can also see there's some shots of archaeology and archaeological finds from the Battle of Cannae. This is a Greek-style Corinthian helmet. It's not clear whether this was worn by the Romans. Maybe they were using older Greek helmets at this point, or if it was perhaps worn by the Carthaginians, or if maybe it was from earlier. Remember, the Greeks had a presence in southern Italy called Magna Graecia, which we talked about previously in this class. And here is an image of the battlefield at Cannae, which has been preserved as a battlefield park. Eventually, the Romans are able to outlast the Carthaginians and then even counterattack in North Africa. Scipio leads this counterattack with some help from Numidian cavalry. The Battle of Zama was the battle that led to the defeat of the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. It was fought 19th of October, 202 BCE, and the Romans and the Numidians were actually outnumbered by the Carthaginians, who had 40,000 troops and they had war elephants. Basically, the Romans won this battle because they learned how to fight war elephants. They learned tactics and strategies that were effective against war elephants. They basically allowed the war elephants to enter their lines, and then they defeated the war elephants by launching projectiles at them, javelins, arrows, things of that nature. And then at the same time, the Roman and Numidian cavalry surrounded the Carthaginian rear and destroyed them from both sides. So actually what happened is this battle is fairly similar to the Battle of Cannae. Not only had the Romans learned how to defeat war elephants, but they were kind of copying the older Carthaginian tactic, letting the Carthaginians charge them and then surrounding them and then defeating them. And of course, this leads to the Roman victory in the Second Punic War and Hannibal being exiled from Carthage. Here are some projectile weapons, namely javelins, which were called pilums or pilla. They would have used weapons like this, javelins which are thrown to defeat the war elephants. The Romans, at least later, designed their pilla, their javelins, to bend upon impact. That way the javelin could not be thrown back and possibly kill Roman soldiers. So there's a lot of technological innovation in Roman warfare. The Roman Republican military structure also played an important role in their victory in the Second Punic War. The Romans at this point used a military structure called the maniple. They're not going to use the legion system that we know pretty well today until a little bit later, but the maniple evolves into the legion system. Basically, the maniple system involved lining up several classes or ranks of soldiers. The hastati were usually younger, less wealthy, less experienced soldiers that would be put in the front of the maniple. After that, the princeps, or the veteran soldiers who had more combat experience, were in the middle, and they basically kept everyone together because they had both strength and youth on their side, but also a little bit of military experience. And then in the back were the triarii, who were the oldest veterans and were older and not as youthful and energetic. And they were used as a last resort. In fact, it was an expression in Roman civilization that if you were down to the triarii, you were at your wit's end. You were about to lose. And they were also joined by what are called velites or velites, and these were poor men that fought as light infantry, and they would fight in the front. They would throw javelins, they would shoot arrows, or launch stones from slingshots at the enemy to try to lure the enemy into attacking the maniple. And they were commanded by centurions who commanded 100 troops roughly, but they were also commanded by optios. And optios were like sergeants or non-commissioned officers. And so this maniple system, using light infantry and then heavy infantry that were very well disciplined and they could work together, along with the Numidian cavalry, also contributes to the Roman victory at the Battle of Zama and then victory in the Second Punic War. So now we'll discuss the third and final Punic War. As you can see, Carthage here in gray is much smaller and weaker. The Numidians have been given independence, and they're basically allies of Rome. Rome has absorbed Carthaginian territory in Iberia. At the same time, they've also taken control of Greece, which we'll talk about briefly in a couple of minutes. The Carthaginians attacked the Numidians without Roman permission. As a client state, they were supposed to consult Rome. They were supposed to go to their patron state, Rome, and ask permission to fight the Numidians. So in response to this violation of the client state obligation system, the Romans will attack Carthage and they'll fight the Carthaginians from 149 to 146 BCE. Hannibal did not take a role in this war. Um, Scipio did not fight. His cousin Scipio the Younger fought. The Carthaginians were led by Hasdrubal, who was a relative of Hannibal, although Hasdrubal was not nearly as capable of a commander as Hannibal was. Scipio the Younger lays siege to Carthage by both sea and land, and he takes control of the city in 146 BC and destroys it. And he sells 50,000 plus Carthaginians into slavery. Remember, capturing of slaves was a major way that the Romans built their civilization. Hasdrubal's wife cursed her husband for being a tactical failure and because he retreated and ran away. Then she praised Scipio the Younger before jumping into a burning building, committing suicide. It's possible that Hasdrubal's wife's suicide inspired the story of Dido and Aeneas that's told later in Roman history, because Dido also committed suicide in a manner somewhat similar to Hasdrubal's wife. The city of Carthage will not be rebuilt for over a century, not until the reign of Augustus Caesar. Legend says that the Romans plowed salt into the grounds around Carthage because they were so angry at the Carthaginians that they did not want their civilization to ever come back. But there's not really any archaeological evidence that the Romans actually did that to the land around Carthage. Here are some scenes from the destruction of Carthage. The Romans used siege engines to break down the city walls. They also surrounded the city and blockaded it with their ships as well. And here is Hasdrubal's wife preparing to commit suicide as a Roman looks on. Here are some shots of the remains of Punic Carthage. Punic is the word that the Romans used to refer to the Carthaginians. Punic means Phoenician in Latin because the Phoenicians were the ones who founded Carthage. You can see that Punic Carthaginian construction is very square and very boxy. Later Roman construction on top of Carthage was called New Carthage or Carthago Novum. It has a lot more elements of Greco-Roman architecture, but the old buildings are much more square and boxy and rather plain, as this reconstructed image shows. They're much boxier than Greco-Roman buildings. Also, we should discuss briefly the Roman takeover of Greece, which occurred from about 200 to 146 BCE. This was occurring sort of simultaneously with the Third Punic War. The Romans had been encroaching and expanding into Greek territory for over half a century. The decisive battle was fought at Corinth in 146 BCE. Basically, by the late 140s, most of the Greek city-states south of Macedonia had been made into what was called a client state. Remember, a client state is semi-independent, but is still obligated to obey Rome. And the Romans said to the Achaean League, now that you are our client state, you have freedom. The Greek city-states didn't understand what the Romans meant by freedom. They didn't really mean freedom. Remember, patrons always said, you are my friend, you are free, but they didn't actually mean it. They meant you have to obey me. And the Corinthians and the Achaean League took freedom literally, and they rebelled against the Romans. So they didn't understand Roman obligation culture, and that leads to the war in which they lose their independence completely. Roman general Lucius Mummius will lay waste to Corinth. He will destroy Corinth because Corinth was like the wealthiest, most powerful city of the Greeks at this point in history. It was also the headquarters of the rebellion against Rome. The Corinthians were also enslaved. Their city was destroyed, but Corinthian Greeks were then spread across the Roman civilization as slaves, and they introduced even more elements of Greek culture to the Romans. Like Carthage, Corinth is going to be rebuilt about 100 years later. And the Romans were admirers of Greek culture. and they spread Greek art and architecture and language across their expanding territorial holdings, especially in the eastern parts of the Roman civilization. In the eastern parts of the Roman civilization, Greek is going to be a very commonly used language, just as much as Latin. Even though the Romans liked Greek culture, they had kind of what historians call a love-hate relationship with the Greeks. They generally thought that the Greeks were weaker and not as strong as they were. They spent too much time on art and not enough time on preparing for war. Here is a bust of Lucius Mummius. You can see from the bust, they're not trying to portray a beautiful man. They're trying to portray a very stern, very war-weary man as a general, like Mummius would have been. Here we see a painting of the destruction of Corinth, the population being sold as slaves. And of course, you can see evidence of the destruction of Corinth even now, although Corinth was going to be rebuilt by the Romans. So now we'll discuss what are called the Marian reforms that come about a century or a half century after Rome's wars with Carthage and Corinth. Roman consul Gaius Marius recognizes that the Roman Empire is growing a lot larger, and he institutes a series of military reforms in the hundreds BCE. The reforms were designed to help the Roman Republic better defend its growing territorial holdings. The old militia system was just not working as campaigns were longer. Soldiers were being deployed further and further away from Italy. They needed to have a standing army to secure the national security, essentially. So Marius creates the cohort and century system, which gives rise to the iconic Roman legions of 5,000 troops. But these small units, cohorts and centuries, between 60 and 100 men, they were much more maneuverable. So Roman troops could mass in legions to overwhelm their enemies, but they could also use small unit tactics with these cohorts. Marius also standardized Roman weapons and armor. Professional soldiers would have their armor provided and standardized rather than having to buy all of their armor themselves. They would also have something like uniforms. They would wear more standardized tunics. The Romans probably didn't all wear red tunics like they do in movies. They probably had different colored tunics based on the legion they were in. Legion pride becomes very important with Marius's reforms for both good and bad consequences. And of course, the reason that Marius was doing all of this was he was trying to transition the Roman military away from the part-time militias into a professional army that could be deployed for longer, and to have professional soldiers that would serve in these legions for 16 to 20 years. And of course, the soldiers in these militaries were called legionaries. This system allows poorer Romans to serve in the military because their gear is being provided for them. They're receiving a salary. It's egalitarian in many ways, also because property requirements are eliminated. Now a Roman who was too poor to afford his own armor, he can serve as a legionary in the same way that perhaps a wealthier Roman could. Before this, a poor Roman who wanted to serve in the military would have either had to serve in the navy as a sailor, or he would have had to serve as amongst the velites, the light infantry who had no armor. On the negative side, though, these professional soldiers who lived with their legions for 20 years, had a lot of pride in their legions, become more loyal to their generals over time and less loyal to the civilian government. And that was going to lead to some civil wars, which will ultimately destroy the Roman Republic and replace it with the Roman Empire. Also on the negative side, this way of fighting is much more expensive. It's now the Roman state has to shoulder the burdens, much more of the burdens of fighting wars, which means taxation is going to have to increase. But it also means that conquest has to increase because conquest brings wealth into the empire. So it kind of feeds a Roman military-industrial complex, although they would not have used that term themselves. Here is an example of how Roman helmets changed thanks to the Marian reforms. On the right here is an older Montefortino helmet made of bronze. It's plainer and simpler and provides less protection than the later Gallia helmet. This Montefortino helmet is incomplete though. It would have had cheek plates that would have hung down from the side here. They've been lost. Of course, these cheek plates are flexible. They're in a hinge here, similar to the later Gallia helmet. The Gallia helmet, some were made of bronze, but over time they're made of iron. Iron, of course, is stronger than bronze. Also, the neck protection plate is much larger on a Gallia helmet, and there's better hearing protection as well. So you can see how the Marian reforms lead to better military technology for the Romans. Here are some examples of how breastplates or chest plates, cuirasses, changed. This is the lorica segmentata, which was probably introduced later, more like the 50s BCE, but it was part of a standardization of the Roman military. This becomes the iconic armor of the Roman legionaries. The legionaries also would have worn older types of armor, lorica hamata or chainmail, and lorica squamata, which is a scale armor. These types of armor are a lot lighter and cheaper to make, but they're also a lot less protective than the later lorica segmentata. And here's the Roman scutum shield. The Romans liked oblong shields. This shield, though, is much more rectangular, and it's also it's convex, meaning it points outward. This convex design provides better protection, but also it allows them to form what's called the testutum, or the tortoise shield wall. It's a lot like a Greek phalanx, but much more protective. Also, the convex shape on the upper layer of scutum shields allows the legionaries to see and to charge their enemies, but also to stick a gladius sword out so they can not only see, but they can fend off their enemies as well when they're in the testutum formation. Here are some modern reenactors wearing various types of Roman armor. These reenactors here are pre-Marian, based on the helmets. These are more like simpler Montefortino helmets, often decorated with feathers. They're using oval-shaped shields, and they're using, these look like lorica hamata chainmail. These legionaries are from much later, or they're impersonating later Roman soldiers who have Gallia helmets and lorica segmentata and scutum shields. Much better armor, but much more expensive. Of course, you can see the similarities between Roman armor and modern armor. Modern football pads, similar shape to lorica segmentata, and riot police today use riot shields that are similar. They have a convex shape similar to that of the Roman scutum shield. Here's a structure of the Roman legion. You can see the cohorts. There were usually 10 cohorts. They were, of course, accompanied by cavalry and light troops. Light troops did not have the kind of armor, and usually they were not legionaries. They were what were called auxiliaries. We'll talk about auxiliaries in the next video. The century, of course, included usually more like 80 soldiers. The century means 100 in Latin, but there were usually 80 soldiers and perhaps 20 support personnel, which would have included cooks, physicians, servants, and slaves who provided labor and logistical assistance to the actual soldiers. And you can see how the cohorts would have fit into the larger legion, and the legions typically had about 5,000 troops. And there was a lot of legion pride. Sometimes the legion had different colors they wore. Legions had their own symbols. They also had the Roman eagle. To lose the Roman eagle was a great disgrace and dishonor on a legion. You did not want to have that kind of defeat. So the Marian reforms end up provoking a series of civil wars. The first civil war is fought between Marius, who began these reforms, and a general named Sulla. These were fought from 83 to 81 BCE. Sulla was invading territory in Anatolia, and he was ordered to abandon his campaign because the Senate was too concerned that he would gain too much military glory from his wars. This, of course, backfires and leads to Sulla marching on Rome, and he defeats Marius and the Senate, taking over the Republic and proclaiming himself to be a dictator. There hadn't been a dictator since the Second Punic War up to this point. So it had been about 200 years since they'd had a dictator. As dictator, Sulla began a reign of terror, killing and exiling political opponents. This was, of course, a violation of Roman law to kill his political opponents like this. One such opponent was Julius Caesar, who managed to hide out and survive these pogroms, these killings. Sulla was able to rule and maintain his dictatorship, though, because he had a lot of support from the patrician class. Wealthy people liked Sulla. They thought he was a good leader because he kept people in line. And Sulla will actually resign his dictatorship in about 80 BCE and will return to public life. So even though he took control of the empire violently in basically what was a military coup, he does give up power peacefully. He will be followed, of course, by Julius Caesar, or Gaius Julius Caesar, who lived from about 100 to about 44 BCE. Julius Caesar was from a patrician family. Initially, he was a priest, but he was forced to give up this position because he was being persecuted and hunted down by Sulla. By the way, Caesar, even though he was a patrician, he was from one of the founding noble families of Rome. His family had come upon hard times by the time that Julius Caesar was alive, and they lived a lot more like poor people, even though they were technically patricians. As a young man, he's kidnapped by pirates, and the pirates treat him badly, and they say they want to ransom him. Caesar says, "Oh yeah, your ransom's not high enough. You know, I'm worth a lot more than you think I am." And then Caesar also promises to crucify the pirates if he ever escapes, and the pirates laugh at him, thinking that no one is going to ever ransom him. Caesar is able to get away from the pirates, though, and then he goes and attacks the pirates and has them crucified, exactly like he promised. He becomes a successful general, and he becomes an imperator, and then he wins the consulship, and he rules alongside Crassus and a man named Pompey, in what was actually a triumvirate of 3 consuls, as opposed to 2, the normal number. And Pompey, by the way, was on Sulla's side in the previous civil war. So 2 enemies were brought together in the triumvirate. In about 55 BCE, Caesar invades Celtic territory in Gaul, what is now France and the Netherlands and Belgium. And he did this because Celtic peoples were migrating into Roman territory. But Caesar also wanted to expand the Roman Republic and gain wealth and glory for himself. Caesar would also invade Britain, but he failed to conquer the Celts in the British Isles. It was thought that maybe Caesar actually didn't invade Britain, but archaeological evidence has actually confirmed the documentary sources that Caesar did in fact invade Britain, although he was defeated. The Romans are not going to take control of Britain until the reign of Emperor Claudius. So the disparate Celtic peoples, remember they were different tribes. They don't try to really unite until 52 BCE under a chieftain named Vercingetorix, but it was basically too late at that point. Caesar defeats Vercingetorix in battle at Alesia, and it's said that in his wars against the Celts and his putting down of Celtic rebellions that he may have killed as many as 1 million Celts and enslaved perhaps another million. Those numbers are probably exaggerated. Caesar writes about his war on the Celts in the Gallic Wars and recounts what we would probably call war crimes today. But to a Roman like Caesar, this was bringing glory to Rome, defeating and killing and enslaving Rome's enemies. These were not things to be hidden. These were things to be bragged about. But the Senate and Pompey especially are very nervous about Caesar's successes in Gaul. They recall him from Gaul. And Caesar, just like Sulla, decides he's not going to obey the Senate. He's going to invade Italy. And he crosses the Rubicon River in northern Italy, crossing of the Rubicon was a illegal act. A Roman general with his legions could not cross the Rubicon without permission. It was an act of treason. So Caesar knew that if he died, he would be executed. And it begins the Second Roman Civil War, which Caesar wins. He emerges victorious. He marches on Rome. He forces Pompey and the Senate to flee, and then he becomes the dictator in 48 BCE. By the way, Pompey is assassinated in 48 BCE. He flees to Egypt, which was not part of the Roman civilization at this point, and he's assassinated by Queen Cleopatra VII, who probably killed Pompey as a way to impress Julius Caesar. This is the Suburra district where Caesar grew up. It's basically a slum when Caesar is living there. It has very drab brick buildings. It's not a nice place to live. It's not a place that patricians live. You can see that there's a mixture of Roman and then later medieval architecture at Suburra. It's not been preserved as it was during Roman times. This, of course, is the biggest challenge of urban archaeology. Continuously inhabited sites have layers and layers of human activity, of really valuable artifacts from many different eras. And to try to investigate one period, you often have to destroy other artifacts in other periods. Heinrich Schliemann, of course, did that when he was investigating Troy. Nowadays, archaeologists are much more careful, but it's why archaeology in a place like Rome can actually be very challenging, because a place like Suburra, there's multiple layers of inhabitation. This is a map of Caesar's campaign in Gaul. It shows his brief invasion of Britannia, or England as we call it today. You can see that he's all over what is now France, and also parts of Netherlands and even parts of Germany as well, defeating the various Celtic peoples. One of the reasons the Celts were moving into Roman territory is because of the Germanic people. The Germanic people were basically pushing the Celts westward into Roman territory. Here is a diagram explaining the siege of Alesia, the last battle of Caesar's Gallic War. Julius Caesar trapped Vercingetorix and his army, along with their civilian force, women and children, at Alesia. Caesar fortified his camp around the city, or the town of Alesia, and then the Celts surround Caesar. So the besieger, Caesar, becomes the besieged. But in the end, Caesar is able to outlast the Celts. There's reports that Vercingetorix pushed all of his women and children and civilians out of Alesia so that the Romans would have to take care of them and feed them. And Caesar just chose to let the civilians starve to death rather than weaken his own army. Also, Roman cavalry reinforcements arrived, and they defeated the Gauls that were trying to break into Caesar's defenses from the outside. There's evidence of some structures around Alesia. These are a mixture of Roman and Celtic structures at this battlefield. And this battlefield, by the way, is in the north of France. Here are reconstructions of what we think Caesar's fortifications would have looked like. They would have included these wooden towers in the background and walls, and then in the foreground there would have been a series of moats that would have prevented an assault by the Gauls. Of course, he also put these sticks into the ground that would impale people who were charging his position. The siege itself was fought in September of 52 BCE, so late summer, early fall. With the winter coming, that would have added a sense of urgency to both sides. The Romans were a much smaller force, surrounded by over 250 Celts outside of their fortification. The Celts outside of the fortification were not unified enough to break through Caesar's defenses, and they were routed by Roman cavalry reinforcements. In the end, Vercingetorix surrenders, and eventually he's executed in Rome in 46 BCE to glorify Julius Caesar. And of course, the conquest of Gaul was solidified by the siege of Alesia, and Caesar's victories and the wealth he brings into the Republic allowed him to eventually take control of the Roman Republic as a dictator. This is the remains of a foundation of a Roman military barracks in southeast England. It's believed to have been built during the time of Julius Caesar, highlighting that Julius Caesar did in fact invade Britain, although he did fail to conquer it. It wouldn't be fully conquered until the reign of Emperor Claudius. And even then, the Romans did not conquer the entirety of the island of Great Britain, only part of it. Here is an artist's representation of Julius Caesar meeting with Vercingetorix, who was trying to surrender. You see that Julius Caesar is wearing a Roman toga. It's a reddish-purple color. Julius Caesar liked to wear purple togas. Purple was a color of wealth and opulence in Rome. It was made from the dye made from seashells, from a mollusk, actually initially discovered by the Phoenicians. It will become purplish red will become a symbol of the emperors after Julius Caesar. Caesar himself was not an emperor; he was a dictator. But later Roman emperors will copy Julius Caesar's style. Here is a map of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. You can see the territories that the Romans brought in during the Republic period. You can see Caesar's Gaul as well. And then you can see territories that were brought in later during the imperial period, which will be the subject of the next video. Here's a modern painting of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon into Rome. This is definitely a more negative portrayal of Caesar. We see death and destruction in his behind him, skulls and bones, people crying out and hiding, and we see the earth, and we see that Caesar's ambition is leading him to conquer Rome. Ambition was something that the Romans did not like. Ambition has a very positive connotation to us today, but to the Romans, ambition was an unhealthy desire for power and glory. And the artist in this painting is trying to capture how the Romans would have viewed the ambition of Caesar. Keep in mind that many poor Romans loved Julius Caesar and thought of him as a hero, whereas wealthier Romans were threatened by his ambition because his ambition came at the expense of their power. Here's the Appian Way. This is the road that Caesar and his troops would have marched down to reach Rome. The Romans were famous for building roads. Their roads are of excellent quality, and some are still even in use today. They were made of layers of rock and stone. Oftentimes, the roads were actually built by soldiers, and these roads helped keep the Roman civilization together as it expanded and across the Mediterranean and beyond. So now we'll discuss Julius Caesar as dictator and some of the things he did. He ruled with his second in command, Mark Antony. His title was Master of Horse as second in command. He probably actually didn't take care of Caesar's horse, but that was just how they referred to his second in command. It's a military term. Caesar refused to wear a crown because he did not want to be seen as a king. He knew that Roman society, especially the elite classes, hated kings. Anything that made him seem like a king, he didn't want to do. Instead, he wore crowns of a golden crown of olive leaves, which was to symbolize victory. Unlike Sulla, who really tried to ingratiate himself to the upper classes of Rome, Caesar tried to be a man of the people. This is probably because he lived in relative poverty as a child, and he was forced to flee from his life during Sulla's reign of terror. He identified with poor people in a way that Sulla could not, and he probably identified with poor people in a way that the average wealthy Roman senator could not. So a lot of people really in the lower classes and the plebeian classes liked Julius Caesar and supported his dictatorship. Caesar also gained support of the people by building expensive public works projects, which would have impressed the plebeians. He needed their support to stay in power. some good things that Caesar did in addition to his public works project was he allowed or set up a path that non-Romans in Gaul could become citizens, those that hadn't been killed or enslaved. But becoming a citizen was difficult. It's a difficult process. To weaken the power of the old patrician Senate, he actually increased the Senate from 600 to 900. You might say that he packed the Senate with supporters. Caesar, he was part of a political faction called the Populares. These were people in the Roman government that claimed to be for the people, versus another faction called the Optimates or Optimates, who claimed to be for the upper classes. They were kind of like political parties, but not as organized as modern political parties were. You know, remember, Caesar was from a patrician family. He was from a family that had nobility, but had fallen on hard times. And also, Caesar lived in some pretty rough circumstances as a young man because he was hiding out from Sulla. So it was natural that he would support the Populares and be a man of the people. But even after, as a dictator, he still acted as a general. He's famous to have said, Vene, vide, vice, I came, I saw, I conquered, after defeating Pontus in Asia Minor. So he was a civil leader and a military leader as dictator. And he cast himself as a man of the people, and he was loved by the people. Although a lot of more powerful senators and patricians did not like Julius Caesar, seeing him as a threat to their own power. This is what's left of the Basilica Julia, which was built in about 46 BCE. This was one of the buildings that Caesar built to gain the support of the everyday Romans. He also did a lot of renovations on the Forum complex. Once again, it's so difficult to do urban archaeology, and especially like a place like Rome, because these buildings are constantly being changed, they're being renovated, they're being demolished and replaced. Sometimes buildings are burnt by fire, which we'll talk about in the next video, but the Basilica Julia was one of the buildings that Caesar built to get the support of everyday people. And the renovations that Caesar made are called the Forum Iulum for Caesar or for Julius. And these also would have helped him get support from everyday people. This is what the Forum Iulum might have looked like at the time of Julius Caesar after his renovations. Here's the Theater of Marcellus, which was begun by Julius Caesar but finished by Octavian. Octavian was a relative of Julius Caesar, but eventually became Julius Caesar's adopted son, and Octavian would become the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus. Theaters and entertainment, of course, were important parts of Roman culture, and entertainment provided by wealthy, powerful people in the government to the regular people. That's part of the patronage obligation system. So now we'll discuss the assassination of Julius Caesar. On 15th of March, the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Cassius, stabbed Caesar to death in the Senate. The senators claimed that they killed Caesar because he had become too ambitious, and also because Caesar had announced that he was going to be dictator for life. He was not going to resign from power at any point. He was going to only leave power in death. Everyday Romans were angered at Caesar's assassination. They liked Julius Caesar. They thought he was one of them, a man of the people, even though he was a dictator with absolute power. Everyday Romans supported Caesar's protege and cousin, Mark Antony. And Mark Antony will create the third triumvirate with Lepidus and Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, who becomes Augustus Caesar. Julius Caesar was declared a god on 42 BCE, which would lead to the later tradition of Roman emperors being declared gods. The second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, will go to war against Brutus and Cassius and would defeat them actually in Greece at the Battle of Philippi. Also, Lepidus is eventually going to be kicked out of the triumvirate. So it's not going to be three people. It's going to eventually just be Octavian and Antony. But even Octavian and Antony are going to feud amongst each other, which will lead to the third and final Republican Civil War. This is the Plaza Argentina, said to be the place where Caesar was assassinated. This is what's believed to be the remains of Caesar's funeral pyre, where Caesar's body was burned after his death, along with furniture and gifts from everyday Romans. Remember, the Romans generally preferred cremation as their way of dealing with the dead. And Antony gave a oration about Julius Caesar, what a good leader he was. He calls for the Roman people to support him and his triumvirate against the traitors Brutus and Cassius. This is another moment in Western history that's been duplicated and copied throughout Western literature and art, poetry, theater, etc. And obviously the pyre of Caesar is still a site that people visit nowadays and even place flowers on. Former allies, Antony and Octavian, former friends and supporters of Julius Caesar, you might say clients of Julius Caesar, eventually become enemies. One of the reasons for this was because Mark Antony was spending a lot more time in the eastern sections of the Roman Republic, especially Greece and Egypt, with Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the ruler of Egypt, but she was of Greek ancestry. And Antony was plotting to have Caesarion, the supposed son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, made the next dictator of Rome. Basically, he wanted to create a kingdom where Caesar's alleged supposed son would be the next king or dictator, and Antony would be kind of the shadow leader behind the control of the government. Naturally, Octavian opposed this, and because he wanted to rule Rome himself. Octavian published Antony's plans, particularly his relationship with Cleopatra. That turned a lot of Romans in the western part of the Republic against Antony. They thought he was plotting a foreign takeover of their republic. And they also didn't want to be ruled by a child that was half foreign and not legitimate, because Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were not married. And so Antony is then forced to fight against Octavian. They fight a series of battles, mostly in and around Greece. The Battle of Actium was the decisive battle that basically brought an end to Antony's power. It was fought about September 2nd, 31 BCE. Octavian had trapped Antony's legions in a small port town on the west coast of Greece, and then he surrounded the port with his ships. Basically, they were blockaded on both land and sea, a lot like what happened to Carthage. Octavian's ships were smaller, and he had a lot more ships than Antony, about 400 versus 250. The sea was very rough that day, and the big ships of Antony just could not maneuver in the rough seas. So Octavian's forces were able to defeat Antony's ships. And the morale of Antony's sailors and marines really dropped when they saw Cleopatra fleeing the battle. So in the end, Antony's military power is destroyed, and he's forced to flee to Egypt, only to be pursued by Octavian. This is where the Battle of Actium was fought. This is on the western coast of Greece. The wind was probably also more advantageous for Octavian than it was for Antony. You know, these are the days of sailing ships. Sails would often be taken down for combat when rowers would be used, but it would have allowed Octavian's ships to get into position much more easily before they took their sails down for battle. And this is a prow or ram of a ship from the battle. It's not clear which faction, which side it belonged to. This is a relief commemorating Octavian's victory at Actium. You know, remember it shows the aft castle, it shows Marines fighting, and of course it features rowers. This is the foundation of the Actium Victory Monument that Octavian had built for himself to commemorate his defeat of Antony. All that's left is the foundation, as you can see. After the defeat at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra flee to Egypt, and Octavian's forces follow them and defeat what's left of their troops. Cleopatra flees into what was believed to be her tomb, and then prepares to commit suicide. Antony believes that Cleopatra has committed suicide and stabs himself, preparing to die, only to find that Cleopatra is still alive, and the stories say that he then died in her arms in a very romantic way. In order to avoid being captured by Octavian, Cleopatra also is said to have committed suicide, along with some of her attendants. There's many different accounts about how she killed herself. Some say that she used a viper, an asp snake. Its venom, she allowed the snake to bite her, and then she died. Others say that she may have injected herself with a poison. There were needles and things like that in this point in history, and we know that people in Greco-Roman times knew how to use poisons. We don't know for sure because we have not found the bodies of Antony and Cleopatra. The tomb location is unknown, where they were actually buried. Their final resting place is unknown, but archaeologists debate its location, and there's many sites that they're investigating, which we'll talk about in a moment. Experts believe that the tomb of Cleopatra and Antony was probably in Taposiris Magna, outside of Alexandria. This is, by the way, a necropolis or city of the dead in Greek. There's many individuals buried in this site. Most of their remains are mummified in the Egyptian custom that was adopted by the Greeks that moved to Egypt. This is a bust of Cleopatra found near the site, and this is a bust of Mark Antony as well. Remember, the Greeks that took control of Egypt often portrayed themselves in the Egyptian style to get the support of the Egyptian people. So now we'll look at the tomb and some of the human remains at the tomb. First, we'll look at the tomb itself. It's a series of shafts and graves underground. There are burials that date from the time of the death of Cleopatra in about 30 BCE. There's mummified remains of multiple individuals at the site. The remains have been heavily damaged by flooding. This site is on the coast. Coastlines change with time. Inscriptions of Antony and Cleopatra have been found nearby, so some people think that they were probably buried in this necropolis, although identifying their remains from the others would be very difficult. But this site is still important because it shows that the Greeks were interested in practicing mummification in Egyptian burial rite. The Greeks really didn't like the preservation of bodies in their own civilization. They thought that that was not an appropriate thing to do. But when they took over Egypt, they began to adopt this Egyptian tradition of preservation of the dead. And actually, later Romans will also practice mummification as well once they have control of Egypt. So now we'll look at some of the mummies that are left behind. Here are some of the mummified remains and other interesting remains found at Taposiris Magna. You can see the mummified remains are not in very good shape. There's been water damage. It's really mostly just skeletal remains at this point, as you can see. What's interesting is some of the remains in the site have golden tongues. It's believed that these golden prosthetic tongues were placed inside the deceased after they had died post-mortem so that they could talk with the dead. Here we see the death mask from an anthropoid. Anthropoid means human-shaped coffin. This is made in more the Greek style rather than the Egyptian style. The style is a little bit different than those used by the Egyptians earlier on. And here we see multiple mummified individuals placed together. It's possible these are a family. It's also possible that multiple generations were buried in these tombs, and sometimes even slaves and servants would be buried with the family, post-mortem, of course. Here again is the extent of the Roman Empire at its greatest point. Egypt was added to the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra between like 30 and 27 BCE. We also see Gaul here, brought in by Julius Caesar, Greece, Anatolia, brought in stages, and of course North Africa and Hispania. And then Britannia is going to be brought in under Emperor Claudius, which we'll talk about in a future video. So in 30 BCE, Octavian is elected consul with his general, Marcus Agrippa. 3 years later, by 27 BCE, the Senate declares Octavian Augustus Princeps, meaning the illustrious one, or the first citizen. The Romans will refer to their emperor as the first citizen. Even though Augustus was an autocrat, a king in all but name, he knew he couldn't claim to be a king. He couldn't wear a crown. He couldn't refer to himself as a monarch. The Romans, especially Romans of the upper class, would not have tolerated that. So he refers to himself as the first citizen. And instead of dressing himself as a king, he dresses as a general. We see that he's wearing a toga, a symbol of Roman culture, but he's also wearing a Roman-style breastplate. And the upper class came to support Octavian as emperor, or Augustus Caesar, as he came to be called, because he promised stability for Rome. And he also promised that he would not be a king. And even though he would have, legally speaking, all of the power, he would not just trample over the Senate. And he would do good things for the Roman people. So everyday people liked Augustus Caesar because he was related to Julius Caesar. He was a successful general. And the elite eventually came to support Augustus Caesar because he promised them stability, and he promised that he would not be a tyrant. He promised he would be the first citizen. He would be the chief patron of the Roman people, and everyone would be his client, but he would be a good patron. And so with the ascension of Octavian to Augustus Caesar, his becoming emperor, the Roman Republic comes to an end. And this is a life-size marble statue of Augustus Caesar that's actually in the Vatican, and a coin bearing the profile of Augustus Caesar. Final thing we'll talk about in this video is this statue of Augustus Caesar and its painted replicas. The Romans generally painted their statues in a variety of colors. Here we see Augustus Caesar painted. It's said that he had fairly light skin and that he had reddish blonde hair, as these statues show. He wears purplish red, the color of the Julius Caesar, a color of royalty, but also just a color of wealth. Remember, Augustus Caesar did not want to seem too much like a king, so he portrays himself in armor and a toga rather than like a crown. The armor, of course, highlights his military successes. His breastplate features a series of reliefs showing stories from Roman history and stories of the gods to show that he has not just ruled because of his military power, but because of divine power. Interestingly enough, there's also sphinxes, symbols of Egypt, on his breastplate as well. Those are supposed to symbolize his defeat of Cleopatra and his takeover of Egypt. So to conclude, from the founding of the city of Rome, or settlement of Rome in 753 BC, to the end of the Republic in 27 BCE, the Roman civilization developed a series of core values. Those values are virtue and obligation, the patron-client system, and patriarchal family systems, and also, I would say, militarism and military service. The Roman system of obligation and mistrust of kings would lead to the creation of the Republic in about 509 BCE. Roman society was highly militaristic. Warfare ensured both national security and it brought wealth into the economy. It expanded the Roman civilization from a small settlement in central Italy into, by the time of Caesar Augustus, a multi-continental empire in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. And it would expand even further in the early imperial period as well. The Romans learned from the people they fought and conquered, and even as they enslaved captives and pressured people into becoming citizens, they learned from their enemies, especially the Greeks. Simultaneously, though, even as Roman militarism grew, the Republic, and brought wealth into the Roman civilization, it also threatened the social fabric of the Roman civilization. It led to civil wars and the rise of the Roman emperors and the end of the Republic. And of course, the Roman emperors ruled because they claimed to be patrons and protectors obligated to the Roman people. But they were really kings in all but name. And we'll talk more about the Roman emperors and life in the Roman Empire in a separate video.